All right. Hello, everybody. Today is February 25th. I'm Mr. Sheridan. This is zoology, and we are going to kind of go over what we've been talking about the last few days in zoology as we've gotten into a livestock judging unit. So we're going to review some of the basics that we talked about. We're going to do some of these every single day as we move through new species, as we get into breeding stock. We'll have a number of other basic livestock judging terms and things that we'll go over. But just to review, to start with, we started with, in this unit, judging steers, which are castrated bulls, which means that these animals have one purpose in life, and that is to be slaughtered and to be harvested for meat. So therefore, those are some of the things that we're going to be looking for when we're evaluating steers. It helps that we need to know the endpoint and what the purpose of this livestock is so that we can evaluate them and how good they are at meeting that endpoint. So when we're judging livestock, each class, you're going to get a score, and that score will be out of 50 points. Typically in a livestock judging contest, or even in the classes that we're going to judge today, there will be either a committee or a rules official, someone who feels like they know that livestock really, really well, that's going to make an official placing. That's going to be kind of how your score is measured. So if the official places those animals, or in this case, steers 1, 2, 3, 4, that's going to be the official placing. And then we have what are called cuts. Cuts are used to determine how difficult of a decision that particular pair should be. So in that case where we talk about if our official is 1, 2, 3, 4, with cuts of 2, 2, and 2, that means these cuts, every time that you miss a pair, that takes away from your score out of 50 points. So in this case, if the official is 1, 2, 3, 4, you place the class 2, 1, 3, 4, you're going to miss 2 points. You're going to get a score of 48 on that class because you missed that one pair. It gets a little more difficult if you get these way out of order. If you place them 4, 3, 2, 1, if you place them completely backwards, that gets a little bit more tricky trying to figure out your score. But it is possible, so we can do that. But we won't go through that right now. So what I need you to understand is that there is an official placing. There are cuts, and that's what's going to determine your score when we are judging livestock. New stuff today. I'd like to throw out the term IDs. When we refer to IDs, we're talking about how animals are identified. So for instance, if we are, and I'll share my screen here quickly, if we are looking at a class of steers, for instance, this one that we are looking at today. So there's one pretty significant ID that's going to jump out here. We've got a red steer, and the other 3 are black. So the ID that we are going to use, if you were talking about this class, instead of calling this steer number 1, you could call him the red steer. It's what we call an ID, an identification. Some of those can get more tricky. As you look at this class, these are also fitted steers, meaning that they have hair and that they've actually been fit, like they're going to actually go to a show. So they're going to look a little different than some of the slick shorn classes that we have. But some other examples of IDs as we're talking about, you can see that this steer actually has a little bit of white in his flank so that you could identify him as such. Most of these other steers are going to be, they're just solid black calves, so that you're not going to have as many IDs. But if you don't know which one's the red steer, you're going to struggle. A lot of your questions that are asked about these different classes are going to be specifically about ID. Some of those things could be color. In this case, we're judging steers, so they're all going to be the same sex. But especially as we get into sheep and hogs, those can be you need to identify what the sex of every animal in that class is so that you can identify them. You can also use as identification if there's one steer or a group of calves or a group of animals that stick out for one particular reason. You can call them, if your top pair is significantly heavier muscled than the other 2 animals in the class, you can literally use that as an ID that you've got 2 heavy muscled steers So that would sound something like, if you're giving reasons, it's going to sound something like, in my top pair of heavy muscle steers, I place this one over this one because of blah, blah, blah. So IDs, that's what, when we're talking about IDs, this is what we're talking about. When we, let me stop the share here so you can see my board. Okay, so the other term that I think I've thrown out there a couple of times, I want to make sure that everybody's really clear about, is that you need to understand the class that you're judging, whether it is a market class or a breeding class. We talked yesterday about structural correctness, and we're going to get to that again today, but it makes a huge difference what the purpose of that group of livestock is. If they are going to market, structural correctness isn't important, muscle is more correct, muscle is more important, composition, meaning how much fat they have, is going to be more important than in a breeding class, where if we're judging either bulls that are intact males or heifers, cows, whatever it is, those classes, you're going to prioritize different things depending on the use of those animals. So you need to identify whether you're judging a class of market animals or breeding stock. Does anyone here in person or online have any questions about some of the basic stuff that we've talked about over the last couple of days? I expect that you have this located somewhere in your note sheet. If you want, I will leave this up after class. If those of you who are out here, if you want to come up and take a picture, that's fine too. You can put that in your notes. I'm fine with that, but you need to make sure that you're prioritizing your time and get that done so that you can turn that in as your notes. Okay, we've gone through a few terms, and we're not going to do anything new today. We're just going to talk about the ones that we have, because these are kind of our big. These are the big ones that we need to understand in terms of all livestock, no matter what class you're judging. In terms of muscle, more muscle is usually better. There are extremes where sometimes animals can be too heavy muscled. Doesn't happen very often. We're looking for muscle. Muscle is important, especially when we're talking about livestock species, cattle, sheep, and hogs. Places that we look for muscle. We're looking for shape and expression down that animal's top and through their rump or their quarter in cattle. Fat. When we're talking about market animals, especially in cattle, there is a direct correlation between extra muscular fat, meaning fat that's laid over top of, that's external, that, you know, we're talking about just like on humans. If you start to get too much fat laid up over top of you, there's a direct correlation between that kind of fat and the amount of intramuscular fat that steer has. Intramuscular fat is the muscle that's inside the muscle. It's what gives that meat flavor. We're looking for intramuscular fat. Therefore, we have to have some fat on the outside of these steers. So places that we look for fat, we're looking for in their brisket. And then we talked about on either side of their tail head. That's actually, if you went inside that animal, that's their pin bone. It's where we call it their pins. So we're looking for fat on their pins, in their brisket, and in their flank. Those are indications of what we're looking for, that animal has some condition, that animal is ready to go to market because they've started to lay some fat on, meaning that they have put some muscle, or they put some fat in their muscle. Structural correctness, we're trying to evaluate how well these animals move, so that in the case of market animals, they don't have any issues at all standing up, making it to the feed trough, to water, getting up and down, moving on concrete. Structural correctness is important, but especially when we talk about breeding classes, those animals are going to live longer. They're going to be out on either pasture or you think about outside right now, the last couple of weeks has been very cold. That animal has to be able to get up, move around on frozen ground, has to walk a long ways. Structural correctness is super duper important. And we talked about whether an animal is long strided or not. We'd like them to fill their track. So questions about any of this as we get started here today? This is kind of the overview of what we've done the last couple of days. Wanted to get it recorded so that you will put that in as an instructional video. So if you need to go back and reference that, if some of these terms get lost on you, then you can come back to this. Questions from anybody? Besides huge, heavy eyelids, because everybody's falling asleep. So we're going to move on. Okay. All right.